Good evening. My name is Stephen Helfer, and tonight is the smoking section, which has been on the air for quite a few years now. And I'm happy that we've been doing with my co-host Emily Ouija, we've been doing some Skype interviews with some very interesting people mostly in the UK, it seems. In fact, I think we've done 3 Skype interviews, one with Frank Davis, Christopher Snowden, and Kevin, I don't remember his last name, who is an Englishman living in Greece, and all a very interesting perspective on tobacco and on the war on tobacco. And one of the things that I particularly liked about Kevin's interview was the whole thing about secondhand smoke, whereby anti-smokers can say, well, it's not just a matter of your own personal health, but you are harming other people, particularly what they like to say, vulnerable populations of children and elderly people with your secondhand smoke. And Kevin pointed out, he's a baby boomer, 68 years old, I think. And like me, he was exposed as a child, as a very young child, to a constant exposure to secondhand smoke in hospitals, doctors' offices, the lobbies of movie theaters and other kind of theaters. Anytime his parents had a party, or my parents had a party, there would be lots of smoke, there'd be smoke in cars. Yet our generation seems to be probably the most healthy generation in terms of life expectancy, healthy life expectancy, which has ever lived. Now, this isn't, obviously this is not due to exposure to secondhand smoke. It has with a lot of factors, one of which is modern medicine, and the eradication of a lot of childhood diseases through vaccines and the like. If secondhand smoke was harmful, you certainly would not expect our generation to be living so long and so healthfully. So when anti-smokers, be they private anti-smoking organizations or government officials, claim that secondhand smoke, and they do some kind of study and determine that secondhand smoke raises the risk of lung cancer or heart disease, it's pretty clear that it is not the case, that this is really just some kind of machination on their part to foist this kind of fear of secondhand smoke, and the way they can then say, well, we don't want you smoking if it's not just for your own good, it's for the good of those around you. And without this linchpin of secondhand smoke, they can't say, well, you can't smoke in restaurants, you can't smoke in patios, you can't smoke here, there, and other places. So the secondhand smoke is the real important thing here. As I say, I think Kevin makes this point very well, and perhaps there's no better point than that if secondhand smoke was harmful or lethal, as it say, you would not see so many baby boomers living so long and so healthfully, regardless of whatever putatively scientific studies are promulgated by anti-smoking organizations. And a point that Frank Davis also made that I thought was very good is that he is a defender of the right to smoke, and he is I would assume, I haven't seen a lot of Frank Davis, but he thinks that smoking is a good thing. And he is not very sympathetic to the argument, oh, smoking is terribly bad, but it's my right. However that may resonate with some people, it really does not carry a lot of force. Self-destructive behavior, in the extreme, is not something that people other than extreme libertarians will defend. So he and I and others pretty much say smoking is a good thing, it has its benefits, it may entail some risks, but those risks may be very well worth it. And of course, one of the benefits of smoking, I think, that is very helpful to many, many people is weight control. And not being overweight is something that's very, very helpful in terms of one's heart, in terms of one's joints, and many other things. So that's a very obvious benefit. But a benefit that's not so obvious, I think, is something that has received a lot of scientific scrutiny, and that is the benefits of nicotine itself, or at least what is thought to be nicotine, because there are those of us who feel that nicotine isolated, not in its normal milieu, which is of course tobacco and tobacco smoke, is a very different animal than nicotine in tobacco when it comes in its natural form in the plant, which it is normally in, and which has been cultivated by American Indians for 8,000 years and revered by them. And there's a quotation from a book that I really like that I'm going to read if I can find it, but I may not have it. Oh, here it is, right here, that I like very much, and see if I can find it. I had it, but let's see. Got a lot of papers in front of me, but the American Indians believe there is nothing so suitable to appease the passions. That is why they never attend a council without a pipe or calumet in their mouths. A calumet is, I think, a kind of Indian pipe, which I believe is made from some kind of clay or earth. But this is from a book called Tobacco and Americans, 1960, a scholarly book. And that is actually a quote from a historian in the book. But it's interesting because if you look at histories that were written after, let's say, the year 1990 or 1980, all references to tobacco will include a lot of negative things, and often they will omit tobacco entirely. And it's interesting how history will, it reflects very much on the time in which it's written, as well as the time about which it's written. So, for example, on public television recently, I think it was a BBC production, I saw something on Coco Chanel, who of course was the famous fashion designer, the French fashion designer, who was a very, very heavy smoker, who lived to be 87, but you will find very few photographs of Coco without a cigarette in her mouth. But on this thing that I saw on the BBC, there were no photographs of her smoking. So it's my suspicion that the BBC I don't think they probably airbrushed out the cigarettes, but I think they looked and selected only photographs of Ms. Chanel where she wasn't smoking. So we see how history can be manipulated and changed. But again, in this book, Tobacco and Americans, 1960, it very clearly states the reverence that American Indians had for tobacco and how they thought and felt from their experience that tobacco helped clear the mind and reduce the passions. And that is why, as I've said many times, I think the fact that our government and our Congress has eliminated, for the most part, tobacco in their dealings with each other, they are unable to compromise, unable to look at things clearly and dispassionately, and as a result, we have a frozen government. And I'm sure lack of tobacco is not the only element there, but I think if more politicians, more leaders, more legislators smoked, I think we would have a better functioning government. Now back to nicotine. Jane Brody, who is the health editor for the New York Times for many years, writes, among the effects of nicotine are arousal, relaxation, improved mood, reduced anxiety and stress, better concentration, and faster reaction time. So these are all tremendous benefits. People who are driving cars need faster reaction time. People who are suffering from stress and anxiety, writers who want better concentration. And then from Discover magazine, psychologist Jennifer Rusted of the University of Sussex in Britain calls nicotine the most reliable cognitive enhancer that we currently have. The author of that article goes on to say, in addition to improving visual attention and memory, nicotine has been shown by Rusted to increase prospective memory, the ability to remember and implement a prior intention. Prospective memory means, for example, if you just say to yourself, well, I'm going to go shopping at the store and I'm going to buy milk, and then you go to the store and you forget to buy milk, that's a lack of prospective memory. Something that people, when they get beyond the age of 60, find increasingly apparent. So for example, I have a friend who is a physician, and he was saying to me he was interested in cognitive enhancement for his own self. He's 76 years old and in pretty good health, but evidently he finds that his cognition is in some ways not what it once was. So I said to him I would send him information on nicotine as a cognitive enhancer, but I thought, unfortunately, he seemed to be very close-minded and would not accept any of the information I gave him, which I think is really the opposite of the scientific mind, because the scientific mind is open, is always open, and is willing to experiment. And of course, I think the greatest physicians of all time, and probably the greatest scientists, have often experimented on themselves. A lot of physicians have experimented on themselves. Obviously, they don't want to experiment on themselves with syphilis or something like that, but I thought it would be the best thing for my friend David to do would have been to try snus, as I recommended to him. But it doesn't seem like he just doesn't seem open to it at all. And, it's kind of silly because at the age of 76, I mean, any kind of illness that you are supposed to get from tobacco usually takes 30 or 40 years. So a 76-year-old individual is not going to fall apart or contract heart disease or cancer, even if what the anti-smokers say it was true in this lifetime. And then there's a quote also from the BBC News. Nicotine itself is not a particularly hazardous drug. It is something on par with the effects you get from caffeine. And that's from John Britton, Royal College of Physicians Tobacco Advisory Group. Of course, the word drug itself is a very loaded term, and I have never seen a good definition of it. The best definition I've seen of it is any substance which, administered to a rat, produces 2 scientific papers. So really, just about anything can or cannot be considered a drug. Chamomile tea, is chamomile tea a drug? Is caffeine a drug? Is water a drug? Certainly water changes the body. The body relies upon water. I mean, what is the difference between a drug and food? Not a clear definition. Even though laymen like to use that word drug a lot, what exactly it means is there is no universal scientific definition of it, just as there is no universal scientific definition of what addiction is. Like, for example, in 1994, tobacco executives testified before a very hostile, ugly, browbeating congressional committee on television, and they said that tobacco was not addictive. And everybody said, oh my gosh, how terrible, they are lying, because we all know tobacco is addictive. But there is no universally accepted definition of addiction. Up until that point, in fact, the medical definition of addiction was something that caused intoxication. So, for example, up until that point, or approximately that year, which was 1994, I think, things like caffeine or tobacco, nicotine, could not be considered addiction because it did not intoxicate. Now, of course, they changed the definition, and I think they changed it primarily so that they can include tobacco with it. And now everything is addicting, including sugar, fatty foods, and of course, all kinds of behaviors such as gambling, etc. But anyway, to get back to my original point, nicotine, tobacco have some very, very beneficial characteristics, and one of them is the ability to help people concentrate, to think, often in a dispassionate way, and, by the way, also relax the skeletal muscles, and what that means is that people can sit at a desk and write and think very, very clearly for a long period of time, or it helps. It's not a panacea. It's not going to cure something like ADHD, or ADD, excuse me. But it will ameliorate it. And so then the anecdotal evidence, people like to dismiss actual instances of a particular phenomenon and say, oh, well, that's just anecdotal. We need statistical. But if you think about it, and it was once said by the well-known, well-respected political scientist, if I can find him, let's see here in my paper, the plural of, let's see if I can find that, because I think it's a good quotation, and I think it's very meaningful. The plural of anecdote is data. So when people dismiss anecdotes and accept some kind of statistical data, really what they're doing, data is nothing but an accumulation of anecdote. So anecdotes are important, and they're also very, very clear. You can see them, whereas they're less manipulatable than data. I like to often say that any scientist who can't design an experiment that will come up with data that proves her hypothesis is not a good scientist. There is an awful lot of manipulation of data and manipulation of experimentation to come up with data which are really just the plural of anecdote, to support an hypothesis. Well, I was going to do a smoker of the week, and I think the smoker of the week is someone who indeed smoked very, very heavily, and not only was extraordinarily apt at governing, but had a great, great literary history career. And so I'll go right to him. Everybody will recognize him, of course. And here we have Winston Churchill, who, according to the New York Times, was estimated to have smoked 300,000 cigars, living to the age of 90, not having no health problems, but he had a few health problems, but nonetheless lived to the age of 90, well beyond the average life expectancy of a non-smoker. And according to the Globe and Mail, May 16, 2011, the Globe and Mail is, of course, a well-known British paper. In his time, Churchill was celebrated as much for his literary achievements, 77 volumes, thousands of speeches and essays, as for his statesmanship. He wrote and dictated much of this work standing up, often striding about the room. As one historian put it, in a cloud of tobacco smoke. Winston Churchill, I think, is anecdotal evidence that tobacco not only is helpful to statesmanship and prosecuting a war, which Winston Churchill almost single-handedly ran from Britain, but also producing a large body of very intellectual work, written work, literary work, which was highly regarded by everyone. And I think the fact that he smoked an estimated 300,000 cigars during his lifetime was probably, with the evidence that I have put forward today, probably very, very conducive to his great success. And it certainly did not seem to diminish the number of years that he spent on this earth. And he also was very, very, he was a painter. He enjoyed painting. He was a very, very heavy drinker. One time somebody saw him drink a glass of water and they said, "Winston, I've never seen you drink a glass of water." And he replied, "Well, I just wanted to see if I could do it." So that's anecdotal evidence and not something that I believe should be dismissed. And of course, as we go on, I will return to this topic of the intellectual benefits of tobacco, and I will produce other great scientists and literary figures who not only smoked heavily, but recognized that, are often recognized that tobacco is, as one historian put it, the handmaiden of literature. Well, Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights was down at the State House last week, I think it was last Monday, because the Joint Committee, which is a committee made up of state senators and state representatives, is considering raising the legal age to purchase tobacco to 21. And first of all, it's always to prevent children from smoking, to prevent teenagers from smoking. But in reality, what it is a gradual introduction of total prohibition in this country. They'll raise the age to 21. They'll ban pharmacies from selling it. They'll say you can't smoke here, you can't smoke there. And, now they'll raise it to 21, but maybe In a few years, they may raise it higher than that, to eventually introduce total and complete prohibition. And the whole thing that makes it so foolish, in my opinion, is that the smoking rate among teenagers is lower than it's been in 45 years, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the National Institutes of Health. So there is no good reason. Teenagers are not smoking, young people are not smoking. But one piece of testimony that was particularly a problem there was Monica Lupi, who is the executive director of the Boston Health Commission, said that smoking is the single greatest cause of preventable death. But what she did not say is that this number is based on a computer simulation. It's not actual deaths. And she did not mention also that it's based, that even if you analyze that figure, most of those deaths, the majority, occur after the age of 75. So here is an example of a public health official deliberately misleading the public. Thank you for watching the smoking section. Please call earlier next time. This is Stephen Helfer. Tune in next week, please.